The rooster hadn't crowed yet when Jed Carter woke to the heavy silence of the prairie. It wasn't the stillness of dawn that stirred him from his sleep but a weight in the air, something pressing, something different. Years of riding cattle trails and sleeping under the wide sky had taught him that a man's bones could sense danger long before his eyes confirmed it. He reached for his rifle leaning against the barn wall, careful not to startle the old mare still chewing her hay. When he stepped outside, the cold morning air bit at his skin. And then he saw them. Stretching across the flatland, from the cottonwoods by the creek to the fence posts along his pasture, stood a line of mounted warriors. 200 strong. Their silhouettes were sharp against the rising sun, feathers glinting, spears tall, horses restless. It was the kind of sight that made legends, the kind of sight mothers whispered about in fear and reverence alike. Jed's breath hitched in his chest. His first instinct was fear, not the kind that sends a man running, but the kind that roots him to the earth, forcing him to reckon with his choices. Only yesterday, he'd found that starving child crumpled by the riverbank, ribs sharp as kindling under stretched skin, lips cracked with thirst. He hadn't thought twice when he carried the boy home, wrapped him in a blanket, and fed him warm bread and beans until his eyes softened with life again. Now, staring at the horizon bristling with warriors, Jed realized that act of mercy had set something in motion far bigger than he'd expected. The barn door creaked, and the little boy stumbled out, still clutching the oversized coat Jed had wrapped around him. His dark eyes widened at the sight of his people assembled in strength, and he tugged at Jed's sleeve with a whisper only half caught by the wind. "They came, for me." Jed swallowed hard. "Reckon they came for me, too," he muttered, heart thudding like hooves in his chest. The ground trembled as the warriors began to move forward, a slow and deliberate advance. Dust curled up behind the horses, rolling like storm clouds across the plain. Jed stood tall but still, rifle loose at his side. He knew he couldn't win a fight against 200 warriors, and he wasn't fool enough to try. When they halted, their leader rode ahead. He was a broad-shouldered man with weathered lines carved deep into his face, a war bonnet trailing feathers that caught the morning light. His eyes were sharp, steady, and full of a history Jed could never pretend to understand. Behind him, warriors sat unmoving, like a wall of mountains. "You," the chief said, his voice carrying across the quiet field. "Cowboy." Jed inclined his head, gripping the brim of his hat. "Yes, sir." The chief's gaze slid to the child, who shuffled forward, clutching Jed's leg. "My grandson," the chief said. "We thought him lost. And yet, he stands here, fed, clothed, alive." Jed felt the boy's small fingers tighten around his rough coat. "Found him by the river," Jed answered honestly. "Couldn't just leave him. He was hungry. Cold." A murmur rippled through the warriors, like wind stirring tall grass. The chief raised a hand, and silence returned. He dismounted, stepping closer until only a few feet separated them. Jed felt the weight of every warrior's eyes on him, the air thick enough to choke. "Do you know what this means?" the chief asked. Jed shook his head. "Only know a child ought not to starve." The chief studied him for a long, unbroken moment, as though peering straight into his soul. Then, with a slow nod, he extended his hand, open, palm forward, a gesture of peace. Jed blinked, stunned. He hesitated, torn between instinct and the raw sincerity pressing in on him. Finally, he set down his rifle, removed his hat, and reached out to clasp the chief's hand. The grip was firm, warm, filled with something Jed hadn't felt in years, trust. A collective exhale swept through the warriors, and the tension lifted like fog in sunlight. The boy looked up at Jed, his eyes shimmering. "I told them," he said, his voice quivering with pride. "I told them you were kind." The words cut deeper than any blade could. Jed had lived much of his life alone, carrying the weight of mistakes, bar fights that ended bloody, neighbors turned away in anger, promises to his late wife broken by a bottle. He had long believed he was a man beyond redemption, a soul too weathered to be softened by grace. But here stood a child, frail and honest, calling him kind. And 200 warriors had come to bear witness. The chief gestured, and several riders dismounted, unloading baskets heavy with food, dried meat, corn, beans, berries. Others brought furs and blankets, laying them by the barn door with quiet reverence. Jed's throat tightened. He had expected anger, maybe vengeance. Instead, they brought gifts, generosity for generosity. "This is for you," the chief said. "For feeding one of ours, you shall never go hungry." Jed struggled to find words. I ain't done nothing to earn this. The chief's eyes softened. Compassion earns more than land or gold. It earns life. It earns honor. For the first time in years, Jed felt tears sting his eyes. He turned away, pretending to adjust his hat, but the truth was clear. Something was breaking open inside him, something he thought had died long ago. That morning, as the sun rose higher, Jed found himself surrounded not by enemies, but by a people who had chosen to meet kindness with kindness. The barn that had once been a place of loneliness and toil now echoed with voices, laughter, the warmth of shared food. The boy sat on Jed's knee, eating stew from a wooden bowl, his smile shy but steady. And for the first time in a long while, Jed felt he wasn't alone.